Imagine for a second that you were standing in this quiet, wood-paneled lecture hall.
Oh, that's a great visual.
Right. And it is the summer of 1914. You're a young Oxford academic, and you are reading loud from a text written, over 2,000 years ago by the ancient Greek historian Thucydides.
Hmm.
And he's describing a war that basically tore his world apart. But as you are standing there parsing these ancient Greek syllables about the collapse of a civilization, you hear something right outside the window.
The literal sounds of artillery.
Exactly. World War I has just broken out.
It's an incredibly chilling image to start with, but it perfectly captures the essence of what we are unpacking today.
Yeah. I start there because if you are listening to this right now, I am willing to bet you've had a milder version of that exact feeling recently.
Oh, absolutely.
It's this creeping, pervasive anxiety that hits when you're scrolling through the news, watching global events unfold, and you get this sinking sensation in your gut that history is somehow speeding up, or, terrifyingly, that it is repeating itself.
Yeah, that sense of dread.
Right. So if you've ever watched a major geopolitical headline break and quietly wondered to yourself, are we living through the final chapters of an empire? Well, this deep dive is custom tailored for you. We are not just going to sit with that anxiety today. We're going to dissect it.
And we are going to dissect it using, one of the most monumental frameworks ever constructed in the field of history, because it is a very common feeling today to look around at the chaos, the shifting alliances, the sheer unpredictability of the modern world, and feel like it is completely unprecedented.
We suffer from a sort of chronological exceptionalism, don't we?
We do. We think things have never been this crazy. But the truth is, when you zoom out far enough, and I mean really zoom out, the patterns don't just emerge, they scream at you.
Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We have a massive stack of sources in front of us, all centering on excerpts from the life-defining work of Arnold Joseph Toynbee.
A massive work.
Specifically, his absolute behemoth of a masterpiece, a study of history. And when I say behemoth, I am talking about 10 volumes published over several decades. It is this incredibly audacious attempt to map out the entire life cycle of human civilizations.
It is audacious, and frankly, it is exhausting in its scope. But it is necessary if you want to answer the big questions.
Exactly. And the mission of our deep dive today is to unpack Toynbee's framework. We want to understand how he believes societies actually grow, why they break down, and ultimately, and this is the part that I think will keep everyone listening on the edge of their seats, we're going to use his specific diagnostic tools to examine our own Western civilization.
To see exactly where we stand on his timeline of survival or collapse.
Right. But before we get into the heavy machinery of his theory, let's establish the playing field. Who was Toynbee, and, why should we trust his lens?
Well, to understand the weight of Toynbee's perspective, you have to understand that he wasn't just some academic sitting in an ivory tower theorizing about dust and bones. Born in 1889, educated at Oxford, he was, as you mentioned, steeped in the classics. But reality came crashing into his academic life. During the First World War, he worked in the political intelligence department of the British Foreign Office.
So he had a security clearance, essentially. He was seeing the raw data of a world tearing itself apart.
More than that, actually. In 1919, he was a key player in the Middle Eastern section of the British delegation to the Paris Peace Conference.
Okay, let's unpack this because that is a massive detail. The Paris Peace Conference is where the victorious powers literally sat down with maps and drew the borders of the modern Middle East, broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and penalized Germany.
Precisely. He had a front-row seat to the restructuring of the modern world after the absolute devastation of industrialized warfare. He saw empires formally dissolved on paper. And then he spent the following decades as a director of studies at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. He was a man who understood the mechanics of statecraft, diplomacy, and the raw, brutal calculus of power in the modern era.
But he possessed the long memory of a classical historian.
Exactly.
And his methodology is what really sets him apart from the history books most of us read in high school. Because normally, when we think of historians, we think of hyper-specialization. Right? You have a historian whose entire career is dedicated to, 18th century French agricultural policy.
Or an expert who only writes about the first 3 days of the Battle of Gettysburg.
Right. They focus on these tiny fragments, usually within the confines of modern nation-states.
And Toynbee argues that this is a fundamental error if you want to understand the mechanics of human history. For Toynbee, the smallest intelligible field of historical study is not the nation-state. A nation-state is just a localized symptom. The true unit of study is the entire civilization.
And he categorizes them,
Yeah.
right? He zooms all the way out and identifies 21 distinct civilizations throughout human history.
Yes, he maps out 21 massive cultural and social spheres.
Okay.
The Sumeric, the Hellenic, which we would broadly call Greco-Roman, the Cynic in East Asia, the Orthodox Christian, our own Western civilization, and several others.
Okay.
He argues that you cannot understand a fragment like, say, Great Britain in the 19th century without understanding the broader Western civilization it belongs to. Its shared religious heritage, its economic interdependencies, its philosophical roots.
It would be like trying to understand the function of a single leaf without looking at the tree.
That's a great way to put it.
I love that. And just to establish the vibe for our conversation today, while the text deals with some incredibly heavy themes, we're talking about the rise and fall of empires, the psychology of mass warfare, the spiritual destiny of humanity. Our goal here is to extract those aha moments. We want to find the concepts that make sense of our chaotic world. And I want to make a firm promise to you listening right now. We're going to touch on massive political and cultural forces, but we are not here to take sides in any modern political debate.
Absolutely not.
If Toynbee steps on some ideological toes, left or right, we are just impartially reporting his framework. We're trying on his glasses to see how the world looks.
And to put those glasses on, to really grasp how Toynbee thinks civilizations die, we first have to understand how he completely upended the way we look at time itself.
Right.
This is the foundation of his entire philosophy, and it goes right back to that opening image you painted of the Oxford classroom in 1914.
The Thucydides epiphany. When I read this in the sources, it completely blew my mind. Let's dig deeper into that moment. Toynbee is reading Thucydides, who is chronicling the Peloponnesian War.
Which was this devastating multi-decade conflict between Athens and Sparta that essentially tore the ancient Greek world apart and ended their golden age.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is the psychological shift Toynbee experiences. Before 1914, Toynbee read Thucydides purely as ancient history. It was fascinating but ultimately dead text.
Right.
But as Toynbee is reading about the collapse of the Hellenic world, while his own Western world is suddenly plunging into the abyss of the First World War, the text comes alive. He suddenly perceives meanings, anxieties, and political maneuvers in the ancient Greek text that he had been completely blind to before.
He writes that Thucydides had been over this ground before. That is such a haunting phrase.
It really is.
He essentially realizes that Thucydides and the ancient Greeks were actually ahead of Toynbee in their stage of historical experience.
That is the crucial insight. Toynbee realized that the experience his generation was going through in 1914, the sudden realization that a seemingly stable, prosperous civilization could abruptly tear its own throat out, had already been lived, processed, and written about by Thucydides over 2 millennia earlier.
It's like realizing you and a friend are playing the exact same video game, just in different rooms.
Yes. You hear them talking about this retro game they are playing, and you think, oh, that's ancient history. I'm playing the modern release.
But then you look closely at the mechanics, the boss fights they are dealing with, the strategies they are using, and you realize, wait a minute. They aren't playing an old game. They are playing the exact same game as me, and they are actually one level ahead.
That is such a good analogy. But we need to elevate it to the cosmic scale Toynbee was working with to really understand his point. Toynbee fortified this vision by looking at human history against the discoveries of geology and cosmogony.
Right, he zooms out past history and into sheer planetary time.
Exactly. When you consider the age of the Earth, billions of years, and the lifespan of our solar system, or even just the hundreds of thousands of years that early Homo sapiens existed in relatively static, primitive societal structures, well, the timeline of civilization is a statistical blip.
It's nothing, an infinitesimally brief span of time.
Right. We're talking about maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years total. On the time scale of the universe, the emergence of the ancient Egyptian civilization in the 4th millennium BC, the Greco-Roman in the 2nd millennium BC, and our Western civilization in the 1st millennium AD, they are not separated by vast gulfs of time.
No, they are basically happening at the exact same moment. They are parallel, contemporary experiments in a brand new human enterprise called civilization.
Okay, I want to pause here because this is a massive paradigm shift. Traditional history teaches us a timeline. First came the Egyptians, then they faded, then came the Greeks, then the Romans, then the Dark Ages. than us.
It implies a relay race, handing a baton forward.
Right. But Toynbee is saying, no, don't look at it linearly. Look at them as 21 separate Petri dishes that were all inoculated at roughly the exact same time in the grand scheme of things.
And because they are parallel experiments, the traditional chronological labels we use, calling one era modern simply because we are living in it, and another ancient because it happened on a previous page of the calendar, are philosophically meaningless. Whatever the calendar said, Toynbee realized that Thucydides' Greco-Roman world and his own Western world were philosophically contemporary.
Okay, so if we stick with the Petri dish or the video game analogy, if all these 21 civilizations are running the same basic software, and some of them have already played through to the end and gotten the grim game over screen, does that mean the game is rigged?
That's the terrifying question.
Did someone already write a walkthrough that proves how we are all going to die?
That is precisely the existential dread that Toynbee was wrestling with, and it brings us to a major intellectual rivalry he had. While he was formulating these ideas after the First World War, another historian had just published a book that dropped like a bomb on the European intellectual scene.
Oh, Oswald Spengler.
Yes. A German historian named Oswald Spengler wrote a massive, incredibly influential book called The Decline of the West.
And a colleague hands this book to Toynbee in the summer of 1920. And Toynbee, reading the German text, has a sheer moment of academic panic. He writes that he wondered if his entire life's inquiry had just been preempted, because Spengler was basically arguing the exact same foundational points, right?
He was. Spengler also argued that civilizations, not nations, are the right unit of study, and that they should be viewed as parallel and contemporary entities. Those were cardinal points for both men.
But Spengler's conclusion was deeply deterministic. He offered a very dogmatic timetable.
Deterministic meaning, we have no choice in the matter.
Correct. Spengler argued that civilizations are essentially biological organisms. They arise, they develop, they decline, and they founder in unvarying conformity with a fixed life cycle.
Think of a flower. A seed is planted, it grows a stem, it blooms beautifully in the spring, it inevitably withers in the autumn, and it dies in the winter. Spengler said civilizations do exactly the same thing on a strict, unavoidable schedule.
Wait, that sounds incredibly depressing. Are you telling me Spengler thought it literally didn't matter what human beings actually did? That no matter what laws we pass, what wars we prevent, what art we create, we're just on a biological timer ticking down to winter?
That is exactly what Spengler was asserting. It was a philosophy of supreme fatalism. And while it resonated deeply with a traumatized post-WWI Europe that felt like it was dying, Toynbee ultimately rejected Spengler's approach entirely.
And his reason for rejecting it is so telling about Toynbee's mindset.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't just say, I don't like this because it's sad. He attacks Spengler's methodology. He says Spengler offered absolutely no explanation for why this biological life cycle happens to a society.
Toynbee uses a great Latin term to dismiss Spengler's core thesis. He calls it Spengler's ipse dixit.
Let's contextualize that for the listener. Ipse dixit. Basically, the because I said so argument.
Exactly. It literally translates to, he himself said it. In logic and philosophy, an ipse dixit is a dogmatic and unproven assertion resting solely on the speaker's authority. Spengler couldn't point to a mechanism. He just looked at a few dead civilizations and declared, it's a law of nature.
Yeah, that would fly with Toynbee.
Not at all. Toynbee, coming from the tradition of English empiricism, found this German a priori method starting with a grand, abstract conclusion and forcing the historical facts to fit it to be completely unilluminating.
Right. Toynbee says, you can't just tell me the timetable. I desperately want to know why. What is the actual engine? What is the spark that causes a primitive, static society to suddenly burst into a dynamic civilization? And what is the specific poison that causes it to die?
And if Spengler couldn't explain why the wheels of civilization start turning, Toynbee had to go looking for the engine himself. He had to test alternative theories to unlock this mystery of human progress. And to do that, he first had to clear the field of the other popular would-be scientific explanations of his 19th and early 20th century era.
The two big rival theories, right? Race and environment. And I think it's vital we spend some time here, because these were incredibly dominant ideas at the time, and Toynbee systematically dismantles both of them using pure empirical data. Let's look at race first.
The racial theory of civilization was very prevalent. The idea was that certain physical traits or genetic lineages possessed a unique, innate spark that allowed them to build civilizations, while others were biologically doomed to remain in a primitive state.
And Toynbee looks at this and essentially says, okay, let's look at the actual data of the 21 civilizations. And what does he find?
He finds that the empirical evidence completely invalidates the idea. He points out that members of almost all broad human racial categorizations can be found among the fathers of one or more of his 21 civilizations.
So there was absolutely no correlation between physical traits like skin color or head shape, which were the obsessions of 19th century pseudoscience, and the spiritual or cultural contributions that actually make up the civilization.
None whatsoever.
The sources mention a specific caveat he addresses, which I think is a brilliant example of his logical rigor. At the time he was writing, in the 1930s, he noted that the black race had not yet been identified as the sole originators of one of his specific 21 distinct categorizations.
Right.
Now, a lesser thinker might have used that to support a racial bias, but Toynbee immediately, logically dismantles any racist assumption that could be drawn from that fact.
He applies the cosmic timescale we discussed earlier. He says, given how insanely short the overall timeline of human civilization is, a few thousand years, this lack of a massive, globally dominant, entirely distinct civilization arising from that specific demographic up to that exact date is absolutely no evidence of inherent incapacity.
Right. If you have 21 lottery tickets drawn over 5 seconds, the fact that a specific number hasn't popped up yet doesn't mean the number is mathematically impossible. It just means the draw is still happening.
Precisely. He attributes it simply to a lack of time, a lack of opportunity, or a lack of the specific right stimulus in that brief historical window. It is entirely circumstantial. So the racial theory fails the empirical test. The engine of civilization is not genetic.
So he throws race out the window, then he turns to the second massive theory of his day, environment. The idea that specific geographical or climatic conditions automatically act as an incubator for human greatness. Give people a good river and they will build a pyramid, essentially.
And this one seems more plausible on the surface. Historians pointed to the lower Nile Valley and the lower Tigris-Euphrates Valley. These regions birthed the Egyptian and Sumeric civilizations. The environmentalists argued that the predictable flooding, the fertile soil, and the climate were the mechanical causes that forced these societies to organize and flourish.
But Toynbee doesn't just look at where civilizations did happen. He looks at where they didn't. And he finds massive geographical contradictions.
Because if you claim that A causes B, then every time you have A, you must have B. Toynbee acknowledges the physical realities of the Nile and the Tigris-Euphrates. But then he points to the valley of the Jordan River and the valley of the Rio Grande in North America.
Let's visualize this for the listener. You have the Rio Grande. Geographically, climatically, it is remarkably similar in its physical challenges and resources to the valleys that birthed civilization in the Middle East.
But did the indigenous peoples of the Rio Grande Valley spontaneously generate a massive, complex civilization to rival the Egyptians? No, they did not. The physical conditions were identical, but the outcome was completely different.
He uses another incredible example that really drives the nail into the coffin of the environment theory. He points to the Andean Plateau in South America.
Yes. The Andean Plateau is a harsh, high-altitude environment, yet it spawned a vibrant, highly complex pre-Columbian civilization. The environmentalists might say, the harsh altitude forced them to adapt and become great. But Toynbee counters, look at the highlands of East Africa, specifically around Kenya.
Geographically, meteorologically, remarkably similar to the Andes. High altitude, similar equatorial relation.
Exactly. But there was no African counterpart to the Andean civilization that spontaneously generated in the Kenyan highlands during that same time frame. The environment theory falls apart under scrutiny. A river or a mountain range does not guarantee a civilization.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Toynbee is a respected, Oxford-educated historian. He has just thoroughly debunked the scientific, impersonal, mechanical explanations of his day. Genes don't create civilization, and dirt doesn't create civilization. So where does a serious empirical historian go when science fails to explain the origins of society?
He takes what he openly admits feels like a retrograde step. He abandons the language of physics and biology, and he turns to mythology.
It is a wild pivot. He turns to the German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and his absolute masterpiece, the play Faust.
Because Toynbee realizes that if the spark of civilization isn't a mechanical process, it must be a psychological and spiritual one. And mythology is the language of the human spirit. He looks specifically at the prologue in Heaven from Faust, which itself is a retelling of the biblical story of Job.
Let's break this mythological setup down because it is the absolute key to Toynbee's entire worldview. In this prologue, you have God, the creator, and God's creation is perfect.
But perfection implies finality. If something is truly perfect, there is nothing left to add, nothing left to change. Because his works are perfect, the creator has left himself no scope for any further creative action. It is an impasse. The universe is in a state of static equilibrium. It is flawless, but it is frozen.
And into this flawless, frozen universe steps Mephistopheles the devil.
The devil looks at this static perfection and issues a challenge. He asks God for a free hand to try and spoil one of God's choicest works, a human soul, specifically the soul of Faust.
Now, God could just say no. He could protect his perfect creation. But if he does that, the universe remains frozen forever. So what does God do?
God accepts the wager. And this is the critical philosophical pivot. By accepting the challenge, God genuinely puts his perfect work in jeopardy. He risks destruction, failure, and corruption. But by accepting that terrible risk, God wins something invaluable, the opportunity to carry his work of creation forward, to break the static impasse. The interaction between God and the devil, between perfection and corruption, is the friction that allows something new to be born.
Okay, so how does Toynbee take a 19th century German play about the devil and use it to explain how the ancient Egyptians or the Romans built their empires?
He synthesizes this mythological concept into his grand foundational theory of history, which he calls challenge and response.
Challenge and response.
He says that an encounter between two personalities, or two forces, in the form of a challenge and a response, is the flint and the steel that kindles the creative spark of civilization.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, think about those primitive societies that existed for hundreds of thousands of years before civilization began. Toynbee describes them as being in a state of torpor. They are like God's perfect, static creation. They have found a balance with nature. They hunt, they gather. The generations repeat endlessly, and nothing changes. They are frozen.
They remain static until they are faced with a severe challenge. That challenge is the Mephistophelian force. It could be a sudden, drastic change in climate that dries up their hunting grounds. It could be the sudden appearance of a hostile, migrating neighbor. It could be a forced migration into a completely new, hostile environment, like a swamp or a desert.
The challenge disrupts the perfection. It forces a crisis.
And civilization is born when a creative minority within that primitive society successfully meets that challenge with an unprecedented response. Instead of starving when the climate dries up, some creative individuals invent irrigation. They tame the river. That is the response.
But the brilliance of Toynbee's theory is that the response doesn't just return them to the old static balance.
Exactly. A successful response to a challenge inevitably alters the environment and the society so much that it automatically generates a new, completely different challenge. You invent irrigation, now you have a food surplus. The new challenge is, how do you manage the surplus? Who owns it? How do you protect it from raiders?
So you invent property laws, mathematics, and a walled city, which creates the challenge of governance, which creates the challenge of class division.
Precisely. As long as this dynamic rhythm of a new challenge being met with a successful creative response continues, the civilization is in its growth phase. It is alive, moving forward, generating new complexity.
It's a beautiful theory. I have to admit, it feels immensely empowering. It gives humanity its agency back. We are just biological clocks ticking down to a Spenglerian winter, and we aren't just passive products of whether we live near a river or a mountain. We are creative agents. We are the flint to the steel responding to the universe. But there is a terrifying catch to this Faustian bargain, isn't there?
There is a very severe catch. If the engine of growth relies on the creative spirit of humanity genuinely putting its work in jeopardy to face a challenge, we have to assume the jeopardy is real. God risks real failure in the Faust story.
Right. It's not a rigged game.
Exactly. And that means the devil doesn't always lose. The flint and the steel can be struck, and the spark can simply fail to catch.
So if the working of challenge and response beautifully explains the unpredictable, dynamic genesis and growths of civilizations, it also perfectly and tragically explains their breakdowns. A challenge arises, maybe it's a new technology, a new rival, a new internal economic crisis, and the civilization simply fails to meet it. The creative minority runs out of ideas.
And when the response fails, the growth stops. The civilization enters its breakdown phase.
Okay, if I'm following you, this naturally leads to a massive question for us listening today. What does that failure actually look like on the ground? If the devil wins a round and a civilization breaks down, how do we spot it? Because as we've established, Toynbee says we have the corpses of quite a few dead civilizations to examine. What does the autopsy show?
To understand the breakdown, we have to look closely at the internal psychology and dynamics of the society. Toynbee defines a breakdown fundamentally as a loss of control.
A loss of control over what? The borders, the economy.
A loss of control over themselves. During the growth phase, the society is led by what Toynbee calls creative personalities, or a creative minority. These are the people finding innovative, dynamic solutions to new challenges. But when a breakdown occurs, that creative freedom lapses into what he terms automatism.
Automatism. Like society going on autopilot. But why does that happen? Why do smart, creative leaders suddenly become automatic?
It is essentially institutional hubris. A society successfully solves a massive challenge. Let's say they invent a brilliant military phalanx that saves them from invasion. The leaders who invented that are hailed as geniuses. But then a new challenge arises, say, an economic crisis or a completely different style of guerrilla warfare.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Right. Instead of generating a new creative response, the leaders lazily try to apply yesterday's successful solution to today's completely different problem.
They rest on their laurels. They idolize their past success so much that they become rigid. The phalanx worked yesterday, so let's just do more phalanx today, even though the enemy is now using cavalry.
Exactly. They stop thinking and start repeating. Free creative acts are infinitely variable and unpredictable, but automatic processes are uniform, rigid, and regular. This insight leads Toynbee to a fascinating observation. While growing civilizations are all uniquely, brilliantly different from one another because creativity takes many forms, dying civilizations all look eerily similar. They all fall into the exact same mechanical patterns of decay.
He breaks down the anatomy of this disintegration. And reading it, it's chilling how recognizable the symptoms are. He says the society literally splits apart. A schism in the body social.
Because the minority at the top is no longer creative, they are no longer freely admired or followed by the masses. They transition from being a creative minority into a less and less effectively dominant minority.
They lose their moral authority. So instead of leading by inspiration, they try to hold on to their status by force.
And on the other side of that schism, the masses of people whom Toynbee collectively calls the internal proletariat become recalcitrant. They realize the leadership is bankrupt of ideas, so they withdraw their spiritual and physical support. The society begins a lethal, agonizing process of self-laceration. It starts tearing itself apart from the inside.
And this is where we have to dispel a myth. The dying process of an empire isn't just a sudden drop off a cliff. Rome didn't just vanish on a Tuesday. It's a drawn-out, agonizing rhythm. Toynbee actually gives us a formula for it, heavily inspired by the military language of advancing and retreating troops. He calls it the rhythm of rout-rally-rout. Can you walk us through this, what he calls the 3.5 beats formula?
Certainly, it is a terrifying heartbeat monitor of a dying society. When a civilization first definitively fails to meet a major challenge, that is the first rout. It is the initial breakdown, resulting in what Toynbee terms a time of troubles.
A time of troubles. This is usually characterized by intense internal conflict, civil wars, and a breakdown of the social contract.
Yes, the society is bleeding out, but it doesn't just immediately roll over and expire. The instinct for survival is strong, so the society makes a massive convulsive effort to save itself. This is the first rally.
But because the dominant minority has lost its true creativity, this rally isn't a brilliant new innovation, is it? It usually takes a very specific, heavy-handed political form.
It takes the form of a universal state. The dominant minority, desperate to stop the internal bleeding, manages to temporarily arrest the society's self-laceration by imposing a massive authoritarian peace. They force all the warring factions, all the disparate states, under one massive centralized umbrella.
Stop fighting each other, or I will kill all of you.
Exactly. It is a peace imposed by exhaustion and force. Think of the universal state not as a cure for the disease, but as a heavy lid clamped down on a boiling pressure cooker. It stops the immediate splashing and screaming. It provides a much-needed respite. But because they haven't turned off the heat, because the underlying spiritual or societal challenge remains entirely unmet, the pressure simply builds beneath the lid.
And eventually the pressure cooker explodes. The lid blows off.
That explosion is the collapse of the universal state. That is the second rout. The society relapses into an even deeper anarchy.
Then, depending on the civilization, there might be a brief period of recovery, another desperate attempt to put the lid back on a final rally.
Right. A brief, usually weaker recovery before the final, ultimate dissolution of the society entirely, which is the last rout.
So the full rhythm is rat the breakdown, or time of troubles, then rally, the universal state, then rout, a relapse into anarchy, then rally, a brief recovery, and finally rout, the final dissolution. That's the 3.5 beats. Rout, rally, rout, rally, rout.
Toynbee notes that depending on the specific historical nuances, you might find 2.5 or 5.5 beats in some cases, but the 3.5 rhythm fits the essential pattern of most disintegrating societies perfectly.
To make this incredibly concrete for you listening, Toynbee applies this exact lens to the Hellenic, the Greco-Roman world, and it lines up flawlessly. Let's look at it. First, the Greek city-states fail to unite. They face the challenge of regional cooperation, and they fail. They tear each other apart in the Peloponnesian Wars.
The mud, the blood, the betrayals of the Peloponnesian Wars, that is their first rout. They enter a brutal, multi-century time of troubles. Constant warfare, shifting alliances, sheer exhaustion.
Then, centuries later, Rome emerges as the supreme military power. Augustus Caesar comes along, defeats all his rivals, and establishes the Roman Empire, enforcing the famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace.
This is the Great Rally. Augustus clamps the heavy lid of the universal state onto the battered, bleeding Hellenic world. And you have to understand, for the people living through it, this felt like salvation. The relief of the citizens to just have the civil war stop was immense.
But the underlying societal decay, the loss of true creative vitality, hasn't been fixed. The heat is still on under the pressure cooker. So after about 250 years of relative, heavily enforced peace, the empire suffers a massive collapse. Following the death of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, the 3rd century is an absolute nightmare of civil war, plague, and economic collapse.
That is the second rout. The lid blows off. Then you get a temporary, highly authoritarian recovery under the Emperor Diocletian. He restructures the entire government, binds peasants to the land, and tries to command the economy. That is the final rally. He manages to glue the empire back together for a little while.
But the glue doesn't hold. The society is fundamentally dead. And it goes to pieces irretrievably in the 5th and 6th centuries. The interregnum, the final rout.
The heartbeat monitor flatlines.
Okay, if you are listening to this and feeling a sense of dread as we perfectly map out the autopsy of Rome, take a deep breath. Because having established that clear diagnostic pattern of rout, rally, and rout, Toynbee then turns that exact same clinical lens onto our own world. He asks the ultimate terrifying question, where does our Western civilization sit on this grim heartbeat monitor? Have we already suffered a breakdown?
Brace yourselves, because Toynbee's diagnosis of the West is stark. He doesn't mince words. He identifies our most conspicuous and specific trouble, the fatal disease we are struggling with. He defines it as nationalistic internecine warfare.
Basically, the nations of the West, Britain, France, Germany, America, and so on, tearing each other to pieces.
Yes, but it is supercharged. In the past, wars were fought with limited means. But Toynbee points out that our modern Western warfare is fueled by the massive, unprecedented energies generated by two new forces, democracy and industrialism. When you combine the mass mobilization of a democracy with the mass production of industrialism, war ceases to be a localized skirmish and becomes a totalizing, civilization-ending threat.
So he traces the timeline of our specific illness to see if we fit the pattern of disintegration. He looks back at the modern chapter of Western history, looking for our first rout, and he identifies our first major bout of violent, self-lacerating warfare.
He points to the so-called wars of religion, which devastated Western Christendom from the mid-16th to the mid-17th century. The 30 Years' War, for example, depopulated massive swaths of Europe. It was a period of absolute ideological fanaticism and slaughter.
That is our first rout, our initial breakdown. We failed the challenge of how to handle the Reformation and the splitting of the church. We resorted to slaughter.
Correct. But then, true to the pattern, we had a rally. Following the sheer exhaustion of those religious wars, there was a respite in the 18th century, the era of the Enlightenment.
During the 1700s, warfare became a comparatively mild disease. Toynbee calls it a sport of kings.
Exactly. Contrast the 18th century with the 20th. In the 18th century, armies were small, professionalized, and they maneuvered around each other, often avoiding battle to preserve expensive troops. They didn't carpet bomb civilian populations. War wasn't exacerbated by fanaticism, either religious or democratic. It was a polite, localized affair.
But doesn't that imply we fixed the problem? We had our time of troubles, and then we achieved a rally, a peaceful equilibrium. But this raises an important question. Why did that 18th century peace fail? Why couldn't we just sustain that mild, polite version of civilization forever?
Because it wasn't a true creative response. Toynbee argues that the 18th century rally was abortive and ephemeral because of its spiritual foundation. The toleration achieved during the Enlightenment wasn't based on arduous, difficult Christian virtues like true faith, hope, and charity, they didn't suddenly love their neighbors.
So why did they stop fighting?
Toynbee brilliantly argues it was based on what he calls Mephistophelian maladies.
Devil's sicknesses.
Yes, disillusionment, apprehension, and cynicism. The 18th century peace wasn't a positive achievement of spiritual growth. It was just a facile byproduct of everyone being too exhausted and cynical to fight over religion anymore. They didn't solve the challenge of coexistence. They just got tired of bleeding.
That is such a profound insight. They didn't learn to love each other, they just stopped caring. And because the fundamental challenge of how to live together meaningfully wasn't creatively met, the devil came back to collect his due. The underlying disease flared up again, and because of industrialization, it was much worse this time.
The French Revolutionary Wars at the end of the 18th century introduced the concept of the levée en masse, conscripting the entire male population. This sparked a second, far more violent bout of nationalistic warfare, which bled right into the mechanized global catastrophes of the First and Second World Wars in the 20th century.
That is our second route. We are deep into a terrifying relapse. The 20th century was the bloodiest in human history, but here is where Toynbee points out a massive, glaring anomaly in our Western timeline. Let's look at the formula again. Rout the wars of religion.
Yeah.
Rally the 18th century. Rout WWWI and WWI and WWII. According to his formula, what is supposed to happen next?
The time of troubles is supposed to end with a dominant minority imposing a universal state to clamp the lid on the pressure cooker and stop the bleeding.
Right, the Augustan rally. The Roman Empire, the authoritarian peace. We haven't had that yet.
Exactly. One fact is glaringly plain, Toynbee writes. We have not yet experienced the establishment of a Western universal state. And it's not for lack of trying by various despots.
He points out that Napoleonic France tried desperately to impose one upon us 100 years prior.
And in the first half of the 20th century, the Germans made two desperate, horrific efforts to impose a universal state on the West by sheer military force.
But they failed. They didn't deliver the knockout blow. Britain, America, Russia, the Allies pushed back.
Yeah.
So we are stuck in this agonizing limbo. We are deep in the time of troubles, suffering the devastation of these massive wars, but we haven't yet submitted to the authoritarian peace of a universal state.
And this reveals a profound, almost tragic tension in the modern Western soul. Because, as Toynbee acutely notes, there is a heartfelt, profound aspiration among us for some form of world order. We desperately want peace. We want what the Greeks called homonoia.
Homonoia, conquered, being of one mind.
Yes. We want to secure the blessings of a universal state, the end of global warfare, a unified global economy, stability without paying its deadly curse.
And what exactly is that curse? Why shouldn't we just want a universal state?
The curse of the universal state is that historically it is the product of salvation by the sword. It is the result of a successful knockout blow delivered by one sole surviving military power. It is inherently coercive. Rome didn't ask the Gauls to join. They slaughtered them until they submitted. And what the modern West is looking for instead is the free consent of free peoples to dwell together in unity. We want uncoerced adjustments and diplomatic concessions. We want the peace of Augustus, but without the sword of Augustus.
We want the UN, not the Roman legion. This brings up one of the most fascinating comparisons in the entire text, and it perfectly illustrates this tension. Toynbee compares the Roman Emperor Augustus to the American President Woodrow Wilson around the time of the 1918 armistice after World War I.
It is a brilliant juxtaposition. Toynbee points out the astonishing prestige Wilson enjoyed in Europe at that specific moment in 1918. When he arrived in Paris, millions of people looked to Wilson as a literal savior. Why? Because he represented this exact Western aspiration, a one-world order, a League of Nations built on free consent, democratic principles, and moral authority rather than military domination.
The spirit animating the praise for Wilson was the exact same spirit of desperate faith and hope that animated the Roman poets Virgil and Horace when they praised Augustus for ending the Roman civil wars. The masses just wanted the bleeding to stop.
But the outcome of their two leaderships was completely different. Augustus actually succeeded in providing his world with a universal state because he was entirely willing to be ruthless. He used the sword, he eradicated his political enemies. Wilson aimed for something much higher, much more morally pure, uncoerced, democratic global unity, but he failed to provide it. The League of Nations was weak, America didn't even join it, and it collapsed.
Toynbee quotes a devastating line from the poet Robert Browning to describe this dynamic. That low man goes on adding 1 to 1, his hundreds soon hit. This high man, aiming at 1,000,000, misses a unit.
Wilson aimed at 1,000,000 of voluntary global utopia and missed. Augustus aimed low at mere military domination and self-preservation and hit his 100. And because Wilson's high-minded rally failed, because the League of Nations couldn't contain the pressure cooker, the West plunged right back into the second, even more devastating World War.
And that failure leads to the most chilling part of Toynbee's entire diagnosis, because he is writing this specific chapter on the eve of World War II, and then he revises it right after the war ends. He explicitly updates the text to mention the invention and employment of the atomic bomb.
He talks about this newly contrived release of atomic energy directed not toward industry, but toward the destruction of human life on an unprecedented scale.
He paints a picture of a swift succession of catastrophic events on a steeply mounting gradient. The time between our major crises is shrinking. The distance from the musket to the machine gun took centuries. The distance from the airplane to the atomic bomb took decades. The destructive power at our disposal is growing exponentially. He admits that this inevitably inspires a dark doubt about our future.
It certainly does.
So reading this, I have to ask on behalf of everyone listening who might be spiraling a bit, are we just strapped into a roller coaster heading for a brick wall? If we were in the middle of a massive rout, and we refuse the authoritarian rally of a universal state because we value democracy, and we now have atomic weapons that can end the game instantly, is there no emergency brake? Are we doomed to Spengler's deterministic winter?
Toynbee is very careful here, and this is where he breaks completely from the doomsayers. He firmly, vehemently pushes back against determinism. He reminds us of the core of his theory. A civilization is not an animal organism. It does not have DNA programmed for death. It is not condemned by an inexorable destiny to die after a predetermined life course.
So there is no historical gravity forcing us down.
There is no known law of historical determinism that forces us to leap out of the frying pan of our current time of troubles and into the slow fire of an authoritarian universal state to be reduced to dust. The precedents from dead civilizations like Rome or Sumeria are formidable and sinister, yes. The warning lights on the dashboard are flashing red. But because human beings have agency, because we are the flint and the steel that can creatively respond to challenges, the future remains completely unwritten.
He literally says our destiny depends entirely on our response. The Mephistophelian challenge is here, the atomic shadow is looming, the climate is changing, the political polarization is massive, and we cannot evade these challenges. But we still have the freedom to generate a new response.
Right.
We don't have to choose between total war or global tyranny. We can invent a third option if we are creative enough.
Exactly. And that brings us to the final, perhaps most profound section of Toynbee's analysis, because he acknowledges that failure is a possibility, but he asks a brilliant question. Even if a civilization does fail its challenges, even if it enters the final fatal stages of disintegration and physical collapse, what actually happens during that death process? He asks, what survives the fire?
The chariot wheel and the spiritual chrysalis. This is the section where Toynbee's vision of history transcends the mere political rise and fall of empires and looks at the long-term spiritual evolution of humanity.
When a disintegrating society is finally locked inside a universal state, suffering under the heavy authoritarian lid of a dominant minority, something remarkable happens down in the dark among the oppressed masses, the internal proletariat.
They don't just sit there and suffer, do they?
No. As the physical and political structures of the civilization slowly rot away from corruption and automatism, the proletariat creates something entirely new. They create a universal church.
A universal church. It's like an immune system response to the human spirit. When the state fails to provide meaning or safety, the people build a spiritual community that transcends the borders of the dying state.
Yes. And after the final rout, when the universal state inevitably explodes and the disintegrating civilization completely shatters into the Dark Ages, that universal church lives on. It survives the political collapse. Toynbee calls it a chrysalis.
A chrysalis. Like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly.
Precisely. It acts as the protective casing. It holds the moral values, the essential knowledge, and the spiritual DNA of the dying civilization, keeps it safe through the anarchy, and eventually becomes the womb from which a completely new, often higher civilization emerges.
He gives some great historical parallels for this to prove it's not just poetry. The most obvious to Western listeners is the Greco-Roman world. The Roman Empire battered itself to death. But the true beneficiary of the temporary Roman peace, the Pax Romana, wasn't the Roman state.
No, the Roman state used the peace to rot from the inside out. The true beneficiary was the Christian church. The church used the Roman roads, the common Roman language, and the period of peace to spread and take root. And when the empire finally fell to the barbarians, the church survived. It acted as the chrysalis. It preserved Latin, it preserved literacy, it preserved Roman administrative structures in the form of bishoprics, and it eventually birthed our modern Western civilization.
And it's not an isolated Western-centric phenomenon. He points out that in the Far East, the Tens and Han Empire played the exact same political role as the Roman Empire. They provided the universal state. And the Mahayana school of Buddhism acted as the universal church. It was the chrysalis that carried the spiritual DNA forward into a completely new East Asian civilization after the Han collapse.
It's a recurring pattern of survival.
Okay, so what does this all mean for the absolute biggest picture of human history? If the death of one civilization just acts as the fertilizer for the birth of another, are we just stuck on a hamster wheel? Are we just going around and around forever?
Toynbee addresses this head-on by contrasting two major philosophical views of history. On one side, you have the Greco-Indian view, which is fundamentally cyclic.
Right. The cyclic view, held by brilliant minds like Aristotle and the Buddha, they viewed the process of history as a dreary round of vain repetitions. Civilizations rise, they fall, another takes its place, it falls over and over, endlessly, like the turning of the seasons.
To Western minds, Toynbee notes, this cyclic view reduces human history to a tale told by an idiot, signifying nothing. It is deeply pessimistic. It implies there is no ultimate destination.
And on the other side of the debate, you have the Jewish Zoroastrian view, which is linear. This is the vision seen by the prophets of Israel, Judah, and Iran. They saw history not as a mechanical wheel, but as the masterful, progressive execution of a divine plan. It's a road. It is moving towards something. It has a beginning, a middle, and an ultimate, meaningful destination.
And here is where Toynbee delivers his ultimate, masterful synthesis of human history. He asks, do we really have to choose between the cyclic and the linear view? Are they actually fundamentally irreconcilable? He argues they are not. He uses a brilliant, simple analogy. Imagine a vehicle moving down a road.
Okay, I'm picturing a chariot.
If that chariot is going to move forward on a set linear course, which represents the linear divine plan of human progress and spiritual evolution, how does it physically move? It must be borne along on wheels. And what do those wheels do? They turn monotonously round and round in a constant cycle.
Oh, wow. The spinning wheels are the cyclic rise and fall of civilizations.
Exactly. The repetitive, tragic, cyclical failures of civilizations, the endless rhythm of rout, rally, and rout are the turning wheels that propel the vehicle of spiritual progress forward down the linear path. While the physical civilizations rise and fall in a seemingly pointless loop, some higher purposeful enterprise is actually making headway. The tragedy of history isn't pointless, it's the engine of evolution.
And what is the fuel for that forward momentum? How does the collapse of a state actually push the spirit forward? Toynbee points to the ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus, who made a profound discovery that was perfectly mirrored by the biblical prophets. Learning comes through suffering.
The failures of civilizations cause immense, horrific physical and emotional suffering. But that very suffering, the destruction of the material comforts and the false idols of the state, is the sovereign means of progress. The agony of a collapsing society forces a spiritual awakening among the survivors.
Toynbee points out the historical proof of this. Abraham was an émigré from a dying, disintegrating Sumeric civilization. He left the collapsing city to find a new spiritual path. The prophets of Israel, who forged ethical monotheism, were the children of a civilization in agonizing disintegration, being crushed by Assyrians and Babylonians.
Christianity itself, as we discussed, was born directly out of the terrifying sufferings and the spiritual void of the collapsing Greco-Roman world. The spiritual vehicle leaps forward only when the societal wheel crushes the ego of the present age.
Spiritual progress is forged in the furnace of societal collapse. Which brings Toynbee to his final, most haunting, and perhaps most relevant question for us today. We are living in a modern Western world facing unprecedented existential challenges. The shadow of atomic warfare, ecological crisis, the potential breakdown of our entire globalized system. And Toynbee asks, will some comparable spiritual enlightenment be kindled in the displaced persons of our modern world?
He is asking, if the pressure cooker of the West does explode, will the survivors find an enlightenment akin to what was revealed to the Jewish exiles when they sat weeping by the waters of Babylon after their nation was destroyed?
For Toynbee, the answer to that question, whether the immense suffering of our modern time of troubles will spark a new, higher spiritual evolution, is actually a far greater moment than the physical survival of Western civilization itself.
He essentially says, don't idolize the vehicle's wheel. The civilization is just the wheel. The spiritual enlightenment of humanity is the vehicle's true forward progress. If the wheel has to break to force us to grow spiritually, then the breaking serves a higher purpose.
Wow. We've covered an absolute mountain of intellectual ground today. We started with a young academic reading Thucydides while the cannons of World War I fired in the distance, realizing that time is a flat circle. We explored Gur's devil challenging God, acting as the necessary flint and steel of human creativity. We tracked the tragic, agonizing rhythm of rout, rally, and rout as empires exhaust themselves on the treadmill of history. And we've looked deeply at Toynbee's warning that our own society is far advanced in its time of troubles, searching desperately for a way to achieve a peaceful global unity without succumbing to the curse of the conqueror's sword.
Toynbee gives us a profound, stabilizing lens to view the chaos of our times. It allows us to see the terrifying headlines not just as random, senseless noise or as a deterministic march to the grave, but as the agonizing, necessary labor pains of our own ongoing evolution. It is a framework that demands we look past the immediate political panic and consider the much deeper currents of human endurance and spiritual adaptation.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. A thought inspired directly by Toynbee, but aimed squarely at the reality of our world right now. Toynbee's entire theory of survival, the mechanism that allows humanity to bounce back from the death of an empire, relies heavily on the idea of a universal church, a spiritual chrysalis that forms among the masses to capture the soul, the ethics, and the wisdom of a dying civilization and carry it safely into the future. But look around at our world today. We live in a highly secular, hyper-individualized, incredibly fragmented modern society. If Western civilization does enter its final dissolution, if the political and economic center cannot hold what serves as our chrysalis today, without a unified spiritual or philosophical framework that binds us together across borders, where exactly are we storing the DNA of our culture, our empathy, and our hard-won wisdom to be safely passed on to whatever cycle comes next? Are we building a chrysalis, or are we just rearranging deck chairs?
That is the question.
We'll let you chew on that. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you see a breaking news alert or feel that creeping anxiety about the state of the world, we hope you view it through the lens of challenge, response, and the ever-turning wheel of history. Until next time.